Sigmund Freud, exploring the unconscious mind. In this video, we'll break down one of the most influential philosophers of his time, from believing that childhood played the biggest part of a person's life, to prophesying that the desires of a person's mind go hidden from their conscious awareness. This is Sigmund Freud in his middle years. Not yet the controversial icon who would revolutionize how humanity understands itself, but already formulating ideas that would challenge every comfortable assumption about human consciousness, morality, and civilization itself. Born in 1856 in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, Freud would grow up to become one of the most influential and controversial thinkers of the modern era. His father was a wool merchant, whose business struggles forced the family to relocate to Vienna when Sigmund was 4 years old. Raised in modest circumstances in the Jewish quarter of Vienna, young Freud displayed exceptional intellectual gifts from an early age. He was a voracious reader who mastered multiple languages and showed particular talent for literature and the classics. But Freud's personal attitudes toward actual women were complex. He supported female analysts entering the field and trained several important women psychoanalysts. He had productive intellectual relationships with female colleagues and patients, yet he also made dismissive comments about women's intellectual capacities and supported conventional gender roles in family life. The question remains whether Freud's problematic theories about women invalidate his entire system, or whether his insights can be separated from his prejudices. Modern psychoanalysis has largely rejected Freud's specific claims about penis envy and female superego development, while preserving his emphasis on unconscious processes, childhood development, and the constructed nature of gender identity. Contemporary gender theory has moved far beyond Freud, recognizing diverse gender identities and sexual orientations that his binary model could not accommodate. Yet his fundamental insight that gender is achieved through psychological development rather than simply given by biology remains influential in understanding how individuals come to identify as men, women, or non-binary persons. Part 1. The discovery of the unconscious. Imagine that everything you think you know about yourself is merely the tip of an iceberg. Your conscious thoughts, your deliberate choices, your rational explanations for your behavior, all of this represents only a tiny fraction of what is actually happening in your mind. Beneath the surface, hidden from your awareness, lies a vast realm of memories, desires, fears, and conflicts that powerfully shape your thoughts, feelings, and actions. You are, in essence, a stranger to yourself, driven by forces you cannot see and do not understand. This is the revolutionary and unsettling vision that Freud developed through his clinical work and theoretical writings. The discovery of the unconscious mind represents his most fundamental contribution to human self-understanding, and it remains his most enduring legacy even among those who reject his other theories. Freud's path to this discovery began with careful observation of his patients' symptoms and behaviors. He noticed curious phenomena that conventional medical thinking could not explain. A woman might develop paralysis of her arm even though medical examination showed no physical damage to nerves or muscles. A man might suffer from inexplicable anxiety attacks that struck without apparent cause. Another patient might develop elaborate rituals or compulsive behaviors that seemed irrational even to the person performing them. The traditional medical approach treated such symptoms as signs of organic disease that had simply not yet been detected, or dismissed them as malingering and fraud. But Freud took these symptoms seriously as genuine expressions of psychological conflict. He began to suspect that symptoms had meaning, that they represented compromise formations between conflicting mental forces, and that understanding this meaning might provide the key to treatment. Working with patients using free association, the technique of saying whatever comes to mind without censorship or rational organization, Freud made a startling observation. When patients followed their associations freely, They would often circle around certain topics or memories without being able to directly confront them. They would approach something important, then veer away. They would forget appointments when treatment was getting close to sensitive material. They would develop sudden headaches or insist on changing the subject just when crucial revelations seemed imminent. Freud called this phenomenon resistance, and he saw it as evidence for unconscious mental processes. If patients were fully conscious of everything in their minds, why would they resist their own therapy? Why would they sabotage their own efforts to get better? The answer, Freud concluded, was that they were not fully conscious of their own mental contents. Part of the mind was actively working to keep certain thoughts, memories, and desires out of awareness. He also noticed that patients would sometimes slip in their speech, saying words they did not intend to say, making errors that revealed hidden thoughts. A woman might call her husband by her father's name. A man might confuse words in ways that suggested sexual preoccupations he was not consciously aware of having. These Freudian slips, as they came to be called, suggested that the unconscious mind was constantly trying to express itself, even as consciousness tried to suppress it. Dreams provided another crucial line of evidence for the unconscious. Freud noticed that dreams seemed to follow their own peculiar logic, very different from waking thought. In dreams, contradictions could coexist, time could be distorted, one person could transform into another, and impossible events could occur without surprise. Yet dreams also seemed meaningful when properly interpreted. They contained references to recent experiences, concerns about current problems, and what Freud came to see as disguised fulfillments of wishes. In his landmark work, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900, Freud argued that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. During sleep, when conscious control was relaxed, unconscious wishes could find expression in disguised form. The bizarre, nonsensical quality of dreams resulted from a censorship process that prevented forbidden wishes from being recognized too directly. Dreams worked through symbols, displacements, and condensations to express what could not be, acknowledged in waking life. But what exactly was this unconscious mind? Freud developed an increasingly complex model of mental structure over the course of his career. In his early thinking, he distinguished between conscious thoughts that we are currently aware of, pre-conscious material that we can easily bring to awareness if we choose, and unconscious content that is actively barred from consciousness by repression. The unconscious, in Freud's view, was not simply a storage place for forgotten memories. It was an active, dynamic system with its own rules and logic. The unconscious was timeless. Past experiences remained vivid and powerful, no matter how many years had elapsed. It was amoral. Primitive desires and aggressive impulses existed without regard for social norms or ethical constraints. It operated according to what Freud called primary process thinking, which was characterized by wish fulfillment, symbolic representation, and displacement of energy from one object to another. Perhaps most radically, Freud argued that the unconscious was the primary realm of mental life. Consciousness was not the fundamental ground of mental existence, but rather a special and limited development that arose from deeper unconscious processes. We are not, as Descartes suggested, primarily thinking beings whose consciousness defines our existence. We are fundamentally driven by unconscious forces, with consciousness serving as a late-developing adaptation that allows us to navigate reality more effectively. This view inverted the traditional hierarchy that placed reason and consciousness at the center of human nature. Freud suggested instead that rational thought was a thin veneer over primitive, irrational drives. Our conscious reasons for our actions were often rationalizations rather than true causes. We told ourselves stories about why we did what we did, but the real motivations remained hidden in the unconscious. The implications of this discovery were profound and disturbing. If we are not conscious of our own deepest motivations, then we cannot simply introspect to discover why we behave as we do. If powerful forces operate beneath awareness, then we cannot trust our own self-knowledge. If unconscious conflicts shape our symptoms and behaviors, then simply trying harder or willing ourselves to change will not work. We need some method for making the unconscious conscious, for bringing hidden material into awareness where it can be examined and potentially modified. Freud's method for accomplishing this was psychoanalysis, a therapeutic technique built around free association, dream interpretation, and analysis of resistance and transference. The goal was not to eliminate the unconscious. This was impossible, but to expand the domain of consciousness, to help patients become aware of previously unconscious conflicts so they could deal with them more adaptively. The process was difficult and often painful. Becoming conscious of repressed material meant confronting thoughts and desires that had been excluded from awareness for good reason. It meant acknowledging wishes that violated one's moral standards, recognizing feelings that seemed unacceptable, and facing memories of experiences one wanted to forget. Patients often resisted this process strenuously, even while consciously claiming to want help. Freud's discovery of the unconscious challenged the Enlightenment faith in human rationality and self-knowledge. It suggested that human beings were far more complex, conflicted, and mysterious than they appeared to themselves. It implied that much of what passed for rational thought and civilized behavior was actually driven by primitive impulses that had been channeled but not eliminated. This vision of human nature was deeply troubling to many people. It seemed to undermine moral responsibility. If we are driven by unconscious forces, we do not control. How can we be held accountable for our actions? It appeared to reduce human dignity. If we are merely animals driven by primitive instincts, what makes us special or valuable? It threatened comfortable self-images. If we harbor unacceptable desires and aggressive impulses, how can we maintain our sense of being good people? Yet Freud argued that his discoveries, however disturbing, represented a necessary confrontation with reality. Human beings had already suffered two major blows to their narcissism, he suggested. Copernicus had shown that Earth was not the center of the universe. Darwin had demonstrated that humans were not specially created, but evolved from other animals. Psychoanalysis delivered a third blow by showing that humans were not even masters of their own minds. These narcissistic wounds, however painful, were ultimately liberating, according to Freud. Only by accepting the reality of unconscious mental life could human beings hope to understand themselves and reduce their suffering. Only by acknowledging the power of primitive drives could civilization find better ways to manage those drives. Only by recognizing the universality of forbidden wishes and aggressive impulses could individuals stop tormenting themselves with guilt and shame over thoughts they could not prevent. The unconscious, in Freud's final vision, was not simply an obstacle to be overcome, but an essential part of what makes us human. It was the source of creativity, of dreams and art, of passion and spontaneity. The goal of psychoanalysis was not to eliminate unconscious influence, but to achieve a better balance between unconscious impulses and conscious control, between desire and reality, between individual wishes and social necessities. Part 2. The architecture of the mind. To understand how the unconscious could exert such powerful influence over human behavior, Freud developed increasingly sophisticated models of mental structure. His final and most influential model, often called the structural theory, divided the mind into three systems: the ID, the ego, and the superego. Each system had its own functions, operating principles, and relationship to reality, and much of mental life consisted of dynamic conflicts between these systems. The ID represented the most primitive aspect of the mind, present from birth and operating entirely unconsciously. The id was the reservoir of psychic energy, the source of all drives and instincts. It operated according to what Freud called the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification of desires without regard for consequences, reality, or moral considerations. The id knew nothing of time, logic, or contradiction. It simply demanded satisfaction. Freud believed that the id was dominated by two fundamental instincts: the sexual drive, which he called libido and defined very broadly to include all pleasure-seeking impulses, and the aggressive or destructive drive. These instincts were biological givens, inherited aspects of human nature that civilization could channel but never eliminate. They represented our animal nature, our connection to evolutionary history, the part of ourselves that existed before society and would persist beneath all cultural development. The id's demands were often unrealistic or impossible to satisfy directly. A hungry infant wants food immediately, but the mother cannot always provide it instantly. An adult feels sexual attraction towards someone who is unavailable or inappropriate. A person feels rage towards someone who has power over them and cannot be safely attacked. The id knows nothing of these practical constraints and simply continues to demand satisfaction. The ego developed as a modification of the id, a specialized system that could interact with reality and find realistic ways to satisfy drives. Unlike the id, the ego operated largely consciously, though some ego functions remained unconscious. It operated according to the reality principle, postponing immediate gratification when necessary and finding routes to satisfaction that took account of real-world constraints. The ego was the executive function of the personality, mediating between the impossible demands of the id, the constraints of reality, and the moral prohibitions of the superego. It had to perform a constant balancing act, trying to satisfy instinctual demands while also avoiding danger and punishment. This was no easy task, and much of what we call psychological distress resulted from the ego's inability to successfully manage these competing pressures. Freud compared the ego to a rider on a horse. The horse, the id, possessed the strength and energy, while the rider, the ego, tried to guide that energy in safe and productive directions. But the rider was not always successful in controlling the horse, and sometimes had to let the horse go where it wanted to go, while maintaining the illusion of control. The superego represented the internalization of parental and social values, the voice of conscience and moral prohibition within the mind. It developed through a process Freud called identification, by which children took on the values and standards of their parents, particularly the same-sex parent. The superego was partly conscious, we are aware of some of our moral standards, but also partly unconscious. We feel guilt or anxiety without always knowing why. The superego had two main functions: the conscience, which punished us with guilt when we violated moral standards, and the ego ideal, which rewarded us with pride when we lived up to our highest aspirations. Like the id, the superego could be unrealistic and demanding, insisting on impossible standards of perfection and punishing us harshly for inevitable failures. This three-part structure created inevitable conflict. The id demanded immediate gratification of every desire. The superego insisted on perfect moral behavior and complete renunciation of forbidden wishes. The ego tried to satisfy both while also adapting to reality. No complete resolution of these conflicts was possible. Human mental life was necessarily characterized by tension, compromise, and the constant negotiation between incompatible demands. Freud's vision of mental life was fundamentally tragic. Unlike therapeutic approaches that promised complete mental health or perfect self-actualization, psychoanalysis could at best help people achieve what Freud called ordinary unhappiness in place of neurotic suffering. The human condition involved inevitable conflict between instinct and civilization, desire and morality, individual wishes and social necessities. These conflicts could be managed more or less well, but they could never be eliminated entirely. This structural model had important implications for understanding symptoms and psychological suffering. Symptoms arose when the ego's usual defenses against threatening unconscious material broke down. A symptom represented a compromise between a repressed wish and the defense against that wish. It allowed disguised expression of forbidden desires while also punishing those desires and keeping them from full awareness. For example, a compulsive hand-washing ritual might represent both an unconscious aggressive wish to dirty or contaminate and a defense against that wish, purification through washing. The symptom expressed both the forbidden impulse and the moral prohibition against it, satisfying neither completely but managing to keep both out of conscious awareness. Understanding symptoms in this way suggested that they could not simply be removed or suppressed. If a symptom was eliminated without addressing the underlying conflict, the conflict would find some new expression, a phenomenon Freud called symptom substitution. True therapeutic change required making the unconscious conflict conscious, allowing the person to find more adaptive ways of managing competing impulses. Freud also recognized that the ego developed various defense mechanisms to protect itself from anxiety arising from unconscious conflicts. Repression, the basic defense, kept threatening thoughts and feelings out of awareness entirely. But the ego had many other defensive strategies available: denial of reality, projection of one's own unacceptable impulses onto others, reaction formation, adopting attitudes opposite to one's real feelings, displacement of feelings from dangerous objects to safer ones, sublimation of primitive drives into socially acceptable activities. These defenses were not necessarily pathological. Everyone used them, and they served essential psychological functions. Problems arose only when defenses became rigid and excessive, preventing flexible adaptation to reality. Mature defenses like sublimation and humor allowed relatively direct satisfaction of drives in socially acceptable forms. More primitive defenses like denial and projection distorted reality more severely and led to greater dysfunction. The complexity of Freud's structural model reflected his recognition that human psychology could not be reduced to simple formulas or mechanical operations. The mind was not a rational calculator weighing costs and benefits, but a battlefield where incompatible forces struggled for expression. Understanding any individual required grasping the unique configuration of conflicts, defenses, and compromises that characterized that person's mental life. Part 3. The psychosexual development of the child. Perhaps no aspect of Freud's thinking generated more controversy than his theories about childhood sexuality and the central role of sexual development in shaping adult personality. His claim that children experience sexual feelings and that family relationships were charged with sexual tensions violated every Victorian assumption about childhood innocence. Yet Freud insisted, based on his clinical observations and his own self-analysis, that understanding adult psychology required understanding the child's path through a series of psychosexual stages. Freud defined sexuality very broadly to include all pleasure-seeking activity, not just genital sexuality. He observed that from earliest infancy, children took pleasure in various bodily sensations and activities. The infant sucking at the breast or bottle was not just feeding, but experiencing pleasurable oral stimulation. The toddler learning bowel control experienced pleasure and power in retention and release. These early experiences of bodily pleasure, Freud argued, formed the foundation for later sexual development and shaped fundamental personality patterns. In Freud's theory, psychosexual development proceeded through a series of stages, each characterized by focus on a different bodily zone as the primary source of pleasure. The oral stage, from birth to about 18 months, centered on the mouth and activities like sucking, biting, and tasting. The infant's relationship with the mother was primarily oral, mediated through feeding and the physical comfort of oral contact. Conflicts or fixations during the oral stage could lead to lasting personality traits. Someone who experienced frustration or excessive gratification during this period might develop an oral character marked by dependency, excessive talking, smoking, or other oral activities. They might remain psychologically focused on issues of nurturing and dependency versus independence. The anal stage, from about 18 months to 3 years, coincided with toilet training and the child's growing capacity for control over bodily functions. During this period, the child experienced both pleasure in the bodily sensations associated with elimination and pleasure in the power to control these processes. The parent-child struggles over toilet training represented the child's first major encounter with social demands and the necessity of renouncing immediate gratification for social approval. Anal fixation could produce 2 different character types depending on how conflicts were resolved. The anal retentive character was stubborn, orderly, and miserly, having learned to take excessive pleasure in control and retention. The anal expulsive character was messy, disorganized, and defiant, having failed to fully internalize social demands for control. The phallic stage from about 3 to 5 years marked a crucial transition in development when the child became aware of anatomical sex differences and focused pleasure on the genital region. During this stage, according to Freud, children developed unconscious sexual feelings toward the opposite-sex parent and rivalry toward the same-sex parent, creating what he called the Oedipus complex, after the Greek myth of Oedipus, who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. The Oedipus complex represented Freud's most controversial and theoretically central concept. He argued that every child experienced incestuous wishes toward the opposite-sex parent and murderous wishes toward the same-sex parent. The boy desired exclusive possession of his mother and wanted to eliminate his father as a rival, but he also feared punishment from the father, specifically castration for his forbidden wishes. Resolution of the Oedipus complex occurred through identification with the same-sex parent. The boy renounced his impossible sexual wishes for his mother and instead identified with his father, internalizing paternal values and prohibitions. This identification created the superego, the internal voice of moral authority that enforced the incest taboo and other social prohibitions. For girls, Freud proposed a parallel but different process. The girl initially loved her mother, but turned away from her upon discovering that she lacked a penis, blaming her mother for this perceived deficiency. She then directed her affections toward her father and developed what Freud called penis envy, the wish to possess the male organ she lacked. Resolution occurred through identification with the mother and accepting the feminine role. Though Freud suggested that women's superego development was less complete than men's, because girls did not experience the same intense castration anxiety that motivated boys to fully internalize paternal prohibitions. This aspect of Freud's theory has been heavily criticized as biased, patriarchal, and unsupported by evidence. The assumption that girls envied the penis and felt deficient compared to boys reflected cultural attitudes rather than universal psychological truths. The theory seemed to naturalize male dominance and female submission as products of anatomy and biology rather than social arrangements. Following the phallic stage, children entered what Freud called the latency period, roughly from age 6 to puberty, when sexual interests were supposedly repressed and children focused on developing skills and knowledge. Sexual curiosity and interests did not disappear but were channeled into other activities. This period of relative calm allowed for intellectual and social development without the intense conflicts of earlier stages. Finally, puberty brought the genital stage, when mature sexuality developed and the person became capable of adult sexual relationships. Freud believed that successful navigation of earlier stages was necessary for mature genital sexuality, characterized by capacity for intimacy and concern for a partner's satisfaction, rather than purely narcissistic pleasure-seeking. Freud's developmental theory suggested that adult personality and psychopathology could be understood as results of how childhood conflicts were resolved. Fixation at earlier stages due to frustration or excessive gratification could create lasting character traits and predispositions to particular forms of neurosis. Regression to earlier stages could occur under stress, leading to more primitive forms of functioning. The theory also emphasized the formative importance of family relationships and early experiences. The parent-child relationship provided the template for later relationships. Patterns established in infancy and childhood around dependency, control, sexuality, and aggression would be repeated in various forms throughout life. Understanding the origins of these patterns in childhood could help people recognize and modify them in adulthood. Contemporary psychology has modified or rejected many specific aspects of Freud's developmental theory. The rigid stage sequence, the central importance of the Oedipus complex, and the focus on sexual conflict have all been questioned. Research has not supported the specific claims about penis envy or the universality of Oedipal dynamics. Yet certain core insights remain influential. The idea that early relationships shape later ones, that childhood experiences influence adult personality, that developmental conflicts leave lasting traces. These concepts continue to inform developmental psychology, even among those who reject Freudian specifics. The recognition that parent-child relationships are emotionally complex and can involve conflicting feelings has enriched our understanding of family dynamics. Part 4. The Talking Cure and Therapeutic Technique. While Freud's theoretical contributions remain controversial, his creation of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic method represents an enduring, practical achievement. The psychoanalytic situation, a patient lying on a couch, speaking freely while an analyst listens attentively, became an iconic image of modern psychology. But what exactly was supposed to happen in this unusual relationship, and how was talking supposed to cure mental suffering? Freud's technique evolved considerably over his career, but certain principles remained constant. The fundamental rule was free association. The patient should say whatever came to mind without censorship, selection, or rational organization. This included thoughts that seemed trivial, embarrassing, irrelevant, or offensive. The analyst's job was to listen carefully for patterns, resistances, and hidden meanings that might emerge from this undirected flow of speech. Free association served multiple purposes. It relaxed conscious control, allowing unconscious material to surface more easily. It provided raw material for interpretation, associations that revealed connections between symptoms and hidden conflicts. It created a situation where resistance would become visible. Patients would find themselves unable to associate freely, would forget what they were about to say, would suddenly go blank or change the subject when approaching sensitive topics. The analyst's primary tool was interpretation, offering explanations that connected surface symptoms or behaviors to underlying unconscious conflicts. A good interpretation helped the patient see connections they had not seen before, recognize patterns they had not noticed, understand their own behavior in new ways. Interpretations were most effective when they addressed material that was just on the verge of becoming conscious, not so deeply repressed as to be completely unrecognizable, but not so obvious as to be already known. Timing was crucial. Premature interpretations offered before the patient was ready to consider them would be rejected or would increase resistance. Interpretations had to be carefully calibrated to the patient's current psychological state and defensive organization. The analyst had to judge when the patient had sufficient ego strength to tolerate disturbing insights and when defenses needed to be respected rather than challenged. Dream interpretation remained an important therapeutic tool throughout Freud's career. He believed dreams provided the clearest windows into unconscious wishes and conflicts. Patients were encouraged to report their dreams and associate freely to dream elements. The analyst would help distinguish between the manifest content, what was actually remembered, and the latent content, the unconscious wishes the dream disguised. Dreams worked through various mechanisms that Freud called dream work: condensation, multiple ideas compressed into single images; displacement, important meanings shifted onto trivial details; symbolic representation, abstract concepts represented by concrete images; and secondary revision, rational elaboration imposed on the dream to make it more coherent. Understanding these mechanisms allowed the analyst to reverse the dream work and uncover the hidden wishes. The psychoanalytic relationship itself became an important focus of therapeutic attention. Freud noticed that patients developed intense feelings toward their analysts, feelings that seemed disproportionate to the actual relationship. A patient might become extremely dependent on the analyst, or fall in love with them, or develop intense hatred toward them. These feelings seem to replicate earlier relationships, particularly with parents. Freud called this phenomenon transference. The patient transferred feelings and patterns from earlier relationships onto the analyst. Rather than seeing transference as an obstacle to therapy, Freud came to view it as the most powerful therapeutic tool. In the transference relationship, childhood patterns became alive and observable in the present. Conflicts that had originated in early family relationships could be examined and worked through in the relationship with the analyst. Analyzing the transference meant helping patients recognize that their feelings towards the analyst originated in the past rather than being realistic responses to the present relationship. A patient who became enraged when the analyst went on vacation might recognize that this rage replicated childhood feelings toward an absent parent. A patient who idealized the analyst and needed constant approval might see that this pattern originated in attempts to gain parental love. Working through transference patterns was slow and difficult. Simply understanding the pattern intellectually was not sufficient for change. Patients had to experience the pattern repeatedly in the therapeutic relationship, recognize it repeatedly, and gradually develop new ways of relating. The same conflicts would appear in various forms, need to be interpreted multiple times, and slowly become more accessible to conscious control. Freud also recognized that analysts developed feelings toward patients that could interfere with therapeutic work. He called this countertransference and initially saw it as something to be eliminated through the analyst's own analysis. Later, theorists recognized that countertransference could also provide useful information about the patient if the analyst could observe and reflect on their own reactions without acting on them. The psychoanalytic setting was carefully structured to facilitate this therapeutic work. Sessions occurred at the same time on regular days, typically 4 or 5 times per week. The patient lay on a couch while the analyst sat out of view. This arrangement reduced social pressure and allowed the patient to focus on internal experience rather than the analyst's reactions. The frequency and regularity created continuity and allowed deep engagement with unconscious material. The analyst maintained what Freud called evenly suspended attention, listening without preconceptions or specific focus, allowing patterns to emerge without forcing them. The analyst also practiced abstinence, meaning they did not gratify the patient's wishes for approval, guidance, or special treatment. This frustration was necessary to maintain the conditions under which unconscious patterns would become visible in transference. Freud recognized that psychoanalysis was not appropriate for everyone. Patients needed sufficient psychological mindedness to engage in self-examination, sufficient ego strength to tolerate disturbing insights, and sufficient motivation to endure a long and difficult process. Severe psychosis, extreme personality disorders, and immediate crises require different approaches. The goals of psychoanalytic treatment were modest compared to the promises of some other therapies. Freud did not aim for perfect happiness or complete self-realization, but for what he called the transformation of neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness. The point was to expand self-knowledge, increase flexibility in dealing with conflicts, and help people accept the inevitable limitations of human existence. Success did not mean eliminating symptoms entirely or resolving all conflicts. It meant achieving better balance between competing psychological forces, reducing the rigidity of defenses, expanding the sphere of conscious choice. The patient who completed analysis would not be symptom-free or perfectly adjusted, but might be more aware of their own motivations, more tolerant of their own complexity, and better able to manage inevitable conflicts. Part 5. Civilization and its discontents. Freud's investigations into individual psychology naturally led him to larger questions about human society and culture. If individuals were necessarily conflicted between instinctual drives and moral prohibitions, what did this mean for civilization as a whole? His later works increasingly focused on the relationship between individual psychology and social organization, exploring both how civilization shaped the individual mind and how fundamental human conflicts manifested in cultural forms. In Civilization and Its Discontents, one of his most important late works, Freud argued that civilization necessarily created discontent because it required the renunciation of instinctual satisfaction. Human beings were animals driven by sexual and aggressive impulses. Civilization, organized society with its rules, institutions, and moral codes, demanded that these impulses be controlled, channeled, or sublimated into acceptable forms. This renunciation served necessary purposes. Without control of aggressive impulses, social life would be impossible. People would constantly attack each other in pursuit of their own interests. Without regulation of sexual impulses, families could not form stable units. Property could not be transmitted across generations, and social organization would collapse into chaos. Civilization required that individuals sacrifice some measure of instinctual freedom for the sake of security, cooperation, and social order. But this sacrifice came at a psychological cost. The energy devoted to controlling and renouncing instinctual impulses became unavailable for satisfaction and happiness. The more civilized and morally developed a person became, the more they had to restrict their natural impulses, and the more they suffered from guilt, anxiety, and frustration. Civilization created discontent as its necessary byproduct. Freud saw this as a fundamentally tragic situation with no complete solution. Human beings could not simply abandon civilization and return to some imagined state of natural freedom. Life in a state of nature would be, as Hobbes argued, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Civilization provided enormous benefits: safety, cooperation, technological advancement, artistic and intellectual achievements. But it also demanded renunciation that created lasting psychological tension. The superego, Freud argued, was the primary instrument through which civilization controlled individual behavior. Through identification with parents and internalization of social values, children developed internal voices that enforced moral prohibitions, even when external authority was absent. The superego punished forbidden wishes with guilt, even when those wishes were never acted upon, and even when no one else could know about them. This internalization of prohibition was necessary for civilization, but also created new problems. The superego could become excessively harsh and demanding, creating more guilt than was necessary for social cooperation. Some people developed such severe superegos that they suffered constant self-criticism and could never feel satisfied with their achievements. The very mechanisms that made civilization possible thus became sources of individual suffering. Freud was particularly concerned about the aggressive instinct and civilization's difficulty managing it. He argued that human beings possessed an innate tendency toward aggression and destruction that could never be completely eliminated. This aggressive drive created constant tension with civilization's requirement for peaceful cooperation. Civilization attempted to manage aggression in various ways, turning it inward through guilt and self-punishment, channeling it into acceptable outlets like competitive sports or business, sublimating it into creative activities. But these strategies were only partially successful. Aggression continued to find expression in warfare, crime, and violence. Even within civilized societies, people projected their aggressive impulses onto outgroups, creating enemies who could be attacked with moral justification. The superego itself became a repository for sadistic aggression turned against the self. Freud wrote some of his most pessimistic works during and after World War I, when the supposed triumph of civilization and rationality was revealed as fragile veneer over barely suppressed barbarism. The ease with which civilized Europeans had reverted to mass slaughter suggested that civilization's control over instinct was precarious at best. The war also led Freud to revise his theory of instincts. Previously, he had emphasized the conflict between sexual drives and ego instincts, self-preservation. But observing the destructiveness of war, the repetition compulsion in traumatized soldiers, and the human capacity for self-destruction, he came to believe in a more fundamental duality. Eros, the life instinct, including sexuality and all constructive connecting impulses, versus Thanatos, the death instinct, the drive toward destruction, aggression, and return to inorganic state. This theoretical revision reflected Freud's growing pessimism about human nature and civilization's prospects. If human beings possessed an innate death drive that sought destruction, then civilization's task was even more difficult than he had previously thought. The aggressive and destructive impulses that civilization tried to control were not merely byproducts of frustrated sexuality, but fundamental aspects of human nature. Freud recognized that different civilizations managed instinctual renunciation in different ways and to different degrees. Some cultures were more sexually permissive, but had stricter control over aggression. Others were more tolerant of certain forms of violence, but more restrictive about sexuality. Each cultural arrangement represented a different compromise between instinctual freedom and social order, and each created its own characteristic forms of discontent. Modern civilization, in Freud's view, demanded particularly high levels of renunciation. The complexity of industrial society, the need for delayed gratification to achieve educational and career goals, the nuclear family structure that intensified Oedipal conflicts. All of these features made modern life especially psychologically demanding. The neuroses that Freud observed in his patients were not just individual failures, but symptoms of civilization's excessive demands on human nature. Yet Freud did not advocate abandoning civilization or returning to simpler social forms. He believed that civilization, despite its costs, represented humanity's greatest achievement. The arts, sciences, philosophy, literature, all the products of sublimated instinctual energy, justified the sacrifices required. The question was whether civilization could find better ways to manage instinctual demands without requiring such extreme renunciation that widespread neurosis resulted. Freud offered no simple solutions to this problem. He suggested that psychoanalysis might help by making people more aware of the conflicts they faced, more tolerant of their own instinctual nature, less tyrannized by excessively harsh superegos. Greater self-knowledge might lead to more rational social arrangements that required less extreme renunciation while still maintaining necessary order. But he remained fundamentally pessimistic about the possibility of creating a civilization that would eliminate psychological conflict entirely. The tension between individual desire and social necessity was built into the human condition. The best that could be achieved was better understanding of this tension and more intelligent management of its effects. Part 6. The Royal Road to the Unconscious Dreams held a special fascination for Freud throughout his career. He considered The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900, his most important work, and he spent years developing and refining his dream theory. Dreams represented, in his famous phrase, the royal road to the unconscious, the most direct route to understanding the hidden wishes and conflicts that shaped mental life. Freud's interest in dreams began with his own self-analysis, following his father's death in 1896. Troubled by anxiety and various neurotic symptoms, he began systematically analyzing his own dreams, using free association to explore their hidden meanings. This painful process of self-examination revealed aspects of his own psychology that he had not previously recognized, including residual childhood jealousy toward his father and unacknowledged sexual feelings. From this personal experience and his clinical work with patients, Freud developed a comprehensive theory of dream function and meaning. He argued that every dream, no matter how bizarre or nonsensical, represented a disguised wish fulfillment. The dreaming mind attempted to satisfy wishes that could not be acknowledged in waking life by creating symbolic scenarios that fulfilled those wishes in disguised form. The most obvious examples were simple wish fulfillment dreams, particularly common in children. A child who was denied cake at dinner might dream of eating cake. A thirsty person might dream of drinking water. These straightforward dreams showed the basic mechanism at work. The dreams satisfied a wish that reality had frustrated. But adult dreams were typically more complex and mysterious. Their wish-fulfilling function was disguised through what Freud called dream work, a series of transformations that converted the latent dream thoughts, the actual unconscious wishes, into the manifest dream content, what the dreamer actually experienced and remembered. Dream work operated through several mechanisms. Condensation combined multiple ideas or images into single dream elements. A person in a dream might be a composite of several real people, embodying qualities of each. A single image might represent multiple associations and meanings simultaneously. This compression made dreams economical but also cryptic. Displacement shifted psychic energy from important elements to trivial ones, making dream interpretation difficult. The most emotionally significant aspects of the latent dream thoughts might appear in the manifest dream as minor details, while dramatic dream events might represent relatively unimportant thoughts. The dreamer focused on irrelevant elements while the true meaning hid in overlooked details. Symbolic representation translated abstract thoughts into concrete visual images. Freud believed that certain symbols had relatively universal meanings, particularly sexual symbols. Long pointed objects, swords, sticks, umbrellas, represented the penis. Containers and enclosed spaces, boxes, rooms, caves, represented the vagina or womb. Climbing stairs, flying, and other activities represented sexual intercourse. Freud's sexual symbolism became one of the most mocked aspects of his dream theory. Critics suggested that sometimes a cigar was just a cigar, not a phallic symbol. But Freud insisted that dream symbols needed to be understood in context, through the dreamer's own associations, rather than through mechanical application of a symbol dictionary. The same image might mean different things in different dreams. Secondary revision represented the final stage of dream work, when waking consciousness tried to impose coherence on the dream. Upon waking, the mind attempted to organize the bizarre dream narrative into something more logical and comprehensible, filling in gaps and smoothing over contradictions. This process obscured the dream's original meaning further. Dreams also employed various disguises to evade censorship. Reversal turned elements into their opposites. Hatred might appear as love. The dreamer might be the victim rather than the aggressor. Dramatization converted thoughts into visual scenarios. Instead of thinking, "I am afraid my father will punish me," the dreamer might experience being chased by a frightening figure. Freud recognized that dreams drew material from three sources: recent experiences from the previous day, the day residue, deeply buried childhood memories, and current unconscious conflicts. The dream wove these elements together in ways that revealed connections between present concerns and past experiences. The interpretation of dreams in psychoanalysis followed the method of free association. Rather than trying to interpret the dream as a whole, the analyst asked the patient to associate freely to individual dream elements. These associations revealed the chain of thoughts connecting manifest content to latent meaning. A patient's associations to a dream image might lead back through various memories and thoughts to an unconscious wish that the dream was attempting to fulfill. Freud emphasized that dream interpretation required understanding the dreamer's unique associations and personal history. The same dream image might have completely different meanings for different people. A dog in a dream might represent a beloved childhood pet, a feared animal, a symbol of loyalty, or a disguised representation of someone whose name sounded like a dog breed. Only the dreamer's associations could reveal the specific meaning. He also recognized that dreams often had multiple meanings simultaneously. A single dream might fulfill several wishes at once, represent conflicts from different developmental periods, and express contradictory impulses. This overdetermination made dreams particularly rich sources of information about the dreamer's psychology. Dreams served important psychological functions beyond wish fulfillment. They preserved sleep by transforming potentially disturbing thoughts into symbolic form that could be experienced without waking. They provided a safe space where forbidden wishes could receive partial satisfaction without real-world consequences. They allowed the unconscious to communicate with consciousness in disguised language. Freud paid particular attention to anxiety dreams and nightmares, which seemed to contradict his wish fulfillment theory. Why would the mind create frightening experiences if dreams serve to fulfill wishes? He explained that anxiety dreams represented failures of dream work. The censorship mechanism had broken down, partially allowing threatening material to emerge in less disguised form. The anxiety was a signal that unconscious wishes were becoming too recognizable. Recurring dreams held special significance. When the same dream repeated many times, it suggested an unresolved conflict that the psyche kept attempting to work through. The repetition indicated that the dream work was failing to adequately disguise or resolve the underlying issue. Analyzing recurring dreams could reveal persistent conflicts that shaped the person's psychology. Traumatic nightmares, particularly in war veterans, presented special challenges to Freud's theory. These dreams seemed to repeat traumatic experiences rather than fulfill wishes. Freud eventually theorized that such dreams represented attempts to master the trauma retroactively, to gain control over overwhelming experiences by reliving them in the safer context of dreams. This observation contributed to his development of the repetition compulsion concept and the death drive theory. Dreams also appeared in psychoanalytic treatment through the transference relationship. Patients often dreamed about their analysts, and these dreams revealed important aspects of the therapeutic relationship. A dream in which the analyst appeared as a parent figure might reveal the transference pattern. A dream where the analyst was disappointing or cruel might express negative feelings the patient could not acknowledge directly. The technique of dream interpretation became refined over decades of psychoanalytic practice. Analysts learned to recognize defensive maneuvers in how patients reported dreams, forgetting crucial details, providing overly elaborate interpretations that missed the point. insisting on literal rather than symbolic meanings. The resistance to dream interpretation revealed as much as the dreams themselves. Freud's dream theory has been both validated and challenged by modern neuroscience. Research has confirmed that dreaming serves important psychological functions and that dream content relates to waking concerns and experiences. The discovery of REM sleep and its association with dreaming provided biological confirmation that dreams were universal and essential aspects of mental life. However, the specific mechanism Freud proposed, that all dreams represent disguised wish fulfillment, has not been supported by systematic research. Dreams appear to serve multiple functions: memory consolidation, emotional processing, creative problem-solving, and random activation of brain systems. The sexual symbolism Freud emphasized appears less universal than he suggested. Yet Freud's basic insight, that dreams have psychological meaning and can reveal aspects of mental life not otherwise accessible, remains influential. The method of paying careful attention to dreams, exploring their associations, and using them to understand unconscious conflicts continues in various forms of psychotherapy. Even those who reject Freud's specific theory acknowledge that dreams offer windows into psychological processes that deserve serious attention. Part 7. Eros and Thanatos, the Life and Death Drives. In 1920, Freud published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, introducing one of his most controversial and philosophically profound concepts, the death drive, or Thanatos. This theoretical development marked a major revision in his understanding of human motivation and reflected his growing pessimism about human nature and civilization's prospects. Previously, Freud had conceived of psychological conflict primarily as occurring between sexual drives, libido, and ego instincts, self-preservation. The neurotic struggled between the desire for pleasure and the demands of reality and morality. But this model seemed inadequate to explain certain phenomena Freud had observed: the repetition, compulsion, traumatic nightmares, sadism and masochism, and the human capacity for self-destruction. The repetition compulsion referred to the tendency to repeat painful experiences rather than avoid them. Trauma victims relived their traumas in nightmares and waking flashbacks. People in analysis repeated destructive relationship patterns despite consciously wanting to change. Children played games that reenacted separations and losses. Why would organisms seek out painful experiences if the pleasure principle dominated mental life? Freud proposed a radical answer. Beyond the pleasure principle operated another fundamental drive, the death drive, which sought to return organic life to an inorganic state. All living things, Freud suggested, carried within themselves an impulse toward dissolution, toward the release from tension that would come with returning to the inanimate condition that preceded life. This drive manifested in various ways. Turned outward, it appeared as aggression, destructiveness, and the urge to dominate or destroy others. Turned inward, it manifested as guilt, self-punishment, depression, and in extreme cases, suicide. The death drive explained the human capacity for cruelty, the attraction to violence and destruction, and the ways people sabotaged their own happiness and well-being. Freud posited that psychological life represented a constant struggle between eros, the life instinct, encompassing sexuality, love, creativity, and all forces that bound things together, and Thanatos, the death instinct, encompassing aggression, destruction, and all forces that tore things apart. This dualistic theory gave equal weight to constructive and destructive impulses as fundamental aspects of human nature. The death drive concept proved controversial even among Freud's followers. Many analysts rejected it as speculative philosophy rather than clinical observation. It seemed to rely more on mythological thinking than on empirical evidence. The biological mechanism by which organisms could possess an instinct toward their own destruction remained unclear. Yet Freud insisted on the clinical utility of the death drive concept. It explained sadism and masochism as expressions of destructive impulses directed outward or inward. It accounted for the negative therapeutic reaction, where some patients got worse when treatment was going well, as if they could not tolerate improvement. It illuminated the self-defeating behaviors that otherwise seemed paradoxical. The death drive also had important implications for understanding aggression and violence. If destructiveness was an instinctual drive rather than merely a reaction to frustration, then it could never be eliminated entirely. Civilization could channel, redirect, or sublimate aggressive impulses, but it could not create human beings without aggressive tendencies. This meant that utopian visions of perfectly peaceful societies were delusional. No social arrangement could eliminate aggression because aggression arose from within human nature rather than from external circumstances. The best civilization could achieve was to manage aggression through law, custom, and moral education, directing it into less harmful channels. Freud observed that aggression posed particular problems for civilization because turning it inward created excessive guilt, while turning it outward threatened social bonds. Civilization encouraged internalization of aggression through superego development, making individuals feel guilty for aggressive wishes even when they never acted on them. But this created populations of guilt-ridden neurotics who suffered from their own harsh self-punishment. A second major critique targets the circular reasoning in Descartes' attempt to prove God and validate reason. The Cartesian circle has already been discussed, but deserves emphasis as perhaps the most serious objection. Descartes uses reason to prove God exists, then uses God to guarantee reason's reliability. If reason requires divine validation, how can we trust the reasoning that proves God? The structure seems viciously circular in ways that undermine the entire system. Antoine Arnauld raised this objection in the fourth set of objections published with the Meditations. He pressed Descartes on how we can trust any demonstration, including the proofs of God, before knowing that God exists. If clear and distinct ideas might be false until God validates them, the proofs themselves become doubtful. Descartes seemed to recognize the force of this objection, but never fully resolved it. His various responses addressed different aspects without providing a wholly satisfactory answer. Contemporary interpreters have proposed various solutions to the circle on Descartes' behalf. Some argue that certain truths like the cogito and basic logic are self-guaranteeing. These provide a foundation sufficient to prove God without requiring prior divine validation. Once God is proven, the scope of certainty can expand beyond self-evident intuitions. Others suggest that God validates our faculty of reason generally, not each particular use of it. The circle may be interpretive rather than actual if we distinguish these different roles. But whether any reconstruction succeeds remains debated. A third critique concerns whether clear and distinct ideas really guarantee truth, as Descartes claimed. Many ideas have seemed perfectly clear and distinct to intelligent people, yet proven false. Mathematical axioms once thought self-evident have been rejected in non-Euclidean geometries. Logical principles once considered necessary have been challenged by developments in logic. If clarity and distinctness can mislead, they cannot serve as criteria for truth. Perhaps Descartes confused psychological certainty with actual truth in dangerous ways. Yes. Part 8. The Future of an Illusion. Freud's investigations into human psychology inevitably led him to examine religion, one of the most powerful forces shaping human culture and consciousness. His writings on religion, particularly The Future of an Illusion and Moses and Monotheism, offered a psychoanalytic account of religious belief that was deeply critical yet psychologically insightful. Freud approached religion as a phenomenon requiring psychological explanation rather than as a set of truth claims to be evaluated philosophically. He asked not whether religious beliefs were true or false, but why human beings held them so tenaciously and what psychological functions they served. His answer was that religion represented a collective neurosis, an illusion created to manage fundamental human anxieties about helplessness, mortality, and the harshness of reality. Religious belief, Freud argued, originated in childhood experiences of dependency and helplessness. The infant was utterly dependent on parents, particularly the father, for protection and survival. The father was experienced as all-powerful, capable of providing security or inflicting punishment. As the child grew, they discovered that the actual father was not omnipotent, and that they remained vulnerable to forces beyond anyone's control. Religion preserved the infantile fantasy of a protective father by projecting it onto the cosmos. God became the idealized father figure, infinitely powerful and benevolent, who could provide the protection that actual fathers could not. Religious belief thus represented a regression to childhood patterns of thought, a refusal to accept adult responsibility for navigating a world without divine protection. Freud identified several psychological needs that religion fulfilled. First, it provided protection against nature's terrors and unpredictability. Natural disasters, diseases, death, all the ways that nature threatened human existence, could be interpreted as expressions of divine will rather than meaningless accidents. This made the world feel more comprehensible and less frightening, even if God's will seemed cruel or mysterious. Second, religion offered compensation for the renunciations that civilization required. Since civilization demanded that people control their instincts and sacrifice immediate gratification, religion promised rewards in an afterlife where all earthly suffering would be compensated. The believer who endured poverty, illness, or oppression could take comfort in future heavenly rewards that would make present sacrifices worthwhile. Third, religion provided moral authority and guidelines for behavior. The divine commandments gave absolute status to ethical rules that might otherwise seem arbitrary or culturally relative. People behaved morally not just because society demanded it, but because God commanded it and would punish violations. This supernatural enforcement strengthened social control and made moral education more effective. Fourth, religion offered answers to ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. Why do we exist? What is the purpose of life? What happens after death? Religion provided reassuring answers to questions that might otherwise create existential anxiety. It gave cosmic significance to individual lives and suggested that human existence fit into a larger divine plan. Freud acknowledged that these psychological functions were genuine and important. Religion did provide comfort, meaning, and moral guidance to millions of people. It helped manage anxiety, promote social cooperation, and give people reasons to endure suffering. In this sense, religion was adaptive, serving useful purposes for both individuals and societies. However, Freud insisted that usefulness did not make religious beliefs true. Religion was an illusion, not necessarily a delusion, a false belief maintained despite contrary evidence, but a wish fulfillment that might or might not correspond to reality. Religious beliefs were held primarily because people wanted them to be true, not because evidence supported them. Moreover, Freud argued that religion carried significant costs. It encouraged infantile dependency rather than adult autonomy, It based morality on fear of divine punishment rather than genuine ethical development. It discouraged critical thinking and scientific investigation by claiming that certain questions had already been answered by revelation. It created conflict between different religious groups who could not rationally adjudicate their competing supernatural claims. Most importantly, religion prevented humanity from facing reality honestly and developing more mature ways of managing anxiety and uncertainty. Just as individual neurosis resulted from refusing to confront unconscious conflicts, cultural neurosis resulted from refusing to accept the reality of human vulnerability and mortality. Religion was a crutch that prevented humanity from learning to walk independently. Freud predicted that as scientific knowledge advanced and education became more widespread, religious belief would decline. People would no longer need supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. They would develop more mature ways of managing anxiety and finding meaning. Religion would be recognized as the childhood phase of human culture, something to be outgrown as humanity matured. This prediction has proven only partially correct. While religious affiliation has declined in some developed countries, religion remains powerful globally and has resurged in various forms. Freud underestimated religion's capacity to adapt to scientific knowledge and overestimated humanity's ability to tolerate anxiety without consoling illusions. Freud's analysis of religion as wish fulfillment contains important insights, regardless of whether one accepts his atheistic conclusions. The recognition that beliefs can be influenced by desires rather than evidence remains relevant. The observation that religion serves psychological functions helps explain its persistence. The connection between religious imagery and family relationships illuminates aspects of religious experience. However, Freud's account of religion has significant limitations. It reduces religion entirely to psychology, ignoring philosophical arguments for religious belief and the possibility that religious experiences might actually indicate something real beyond psychological projection. It treats all religion as essentially the same, missing important differences between religious traditions. It assumes that religious believers are less psychologically mature than atheists, a condescending attitude not supported by evidence. Freud's final work on religion, Moses and Monotheism, offered a psychoanalytic interpretation of Jewish history and the origins of monotheism. He controversially argued that Moses was actually Egyptian and that monotheism originated in the brief religious revolution of Akhenaten. The Jewish people supposedly murdered Moses, repressed the memory of this crime, and developed their religion partly through guilt over this founding patricide. This speculative historical reconstruction was unconvincing to most scholars and seemed driven more by Freud's theoretical preoccupations than by historical evidence. However, it revealed Freud's continued attempt to understand religion through the Oedipal dynamics he believed fundamental to human psychology. Religion recapitulated the murder of the primal father and the guilt and totemism that followed. Freud's treatment of religion influenced later psychological and sociological approaches to the subject. His emphasis on religion's psychological functions informed functionalist analyses in sociology and anthropology. His attention to the emotional and unconscious aspects of belief complemented more cognitive approaches. His willingness to subject religion to the same analytical scrutiny as other cultural phenomena helped establish the modern, secular study of religion. Yet contemporary religious psychology has moved beyond Freud's reductionist approach. Religion is now understood as more complex and multifaceted than Freud's infantilism thesis suggested. Religious experience can facilitate psychological growth, community connection, and ethical development in ways Freud did not adequately recognize. The relationship between religion and mental health is complicated, rather than uniformly negative. Part 9. Sublimation, Art, and Culture. While Freud emphasized the conflicts and pathologies arising from instinctual renunciation, he also recognized that civilization produced magnificent achievements. Art, literature, science, philosophy, all the highest human accomplishments required explanation within his theoretical framework. How could primitive sexual and aggressive drives give rise to beauty, truth, and cultural sophistication? Freud's answer was sublimation, the redirection of instinctual energy from sexual or aggressive aims to socially valued activities. When direct satisfaction of instinctual drives was blocked by internal prohibitions or external circumstances, the psychic energy could be channeled into alternative pursuits. A person whose sexual impulses were repressed might become a passionate artist. Someone whose aggression could not be expressed directly might become a brilliant surgeon or an investigative journalist. Sublimation differed from other defense mechanisms in being largely conscious and producing socially valued outcomes. The artist knew they were creating art, even if they did not fully recognize that creative energy originated in sublimated sexuality. The scientist consciously pursued knowledge, even if unconscious curiosity about forbidden topics, parental sexuality, bodily functions, provided some of the motivating energy. Freud saw artistic creation as particularly revealing of sublimation processes. The artist transformed unconscious fantasies and conflicts into culturally acceptable forms that could be shared with audiences. A novelist's characters might express wishes and impulses that the author could not acknowledge directly. A painter's images might symbolize unconscious contents that could not be represented literally. Art served psychological functions for both creator and audience. For the creator, it provided a socially sanctioned outlet for expressing forbidden wishes and working through unconscious conflicts. The creative process allowed partial satisfaction of repressed impulses in disguised symbolic form. The artist achieved fame and admiration for productions that would have brought shame if expressed more directly. For the audience, art provided vicarious satisfaction of their own repressed wishes. Readers identified with literary characters who acted out scenarios that readers could only fantasize about. Theatergoers experienced catharsis by watching tragic events unfold on stage, releasing pent-up emotions in a safe context. Art created a shared space where unconscious contents could be experienced collectively while maintaining the necessary disguises. Freud applied psychoanalytic interpretation to various artistic works, most famously in his analysis of Shakespeare's Hamlet. He argued that Hamlet's inability to kill Claudius stemmed from unconscious identification with his uncle, who had acted out Hamlet's own repressed Oedipal wishes by killing Hamlet's father and possessing his mother. Hamlet could not punish in Claudius what he unconsciously desired himself. Similarly, Freud analyzed Leonardo da Vinci's art and notebooks, arguing that Leonardo's creativity and scientific curiosity represented sublimation of sexual energy. Leonardo's childhood memory of a bird putting its tail in his mouth was interpreted as a fantasy with sexual significance. His obsessive investigation of natural phenomena represented displaced sexual curiosity that could not find direct satisfaction. These specific interpretations have been criticized as speculative and reductive, imposing psychoanalytic theory onto artworks rather than letting them speak for themselves. The evidence for Freud's interpretations was often thin, relying on selective details and theoretical presuppositions. Critics argued that art had intrinsic aesthetic and cultural dimensions that could not be reduced to sublimated sexuality. However, Freud's general approach, treating art as psychologically meaningful and connected to unconscious processes, proved influential. Psychoanalytic literary criticism became an important school of interpretation. The recognition that art could express and evoke unconscious contents enriched aesthetic theory. The connection between creativity and psychological conflict illuminated aspects of the artistic process. Freud distinguished between different types of creative activity based on their relationship to reality and fantasy. Scientific investigation represented the most mature form of sublimation, firmly grounded in reality testing and rational thought. Artistic creation occupied a middle ground, transforming fantasy into culturally valued forms while maintaining some connection to reality. Neurotic symptoms represented failed sublimation, where fantasy overwhelmed reality and created dysfunction. The capacity for sublimation varied among individuals depending on constitutional factors and developmental history. Some people possessed natural gifts that made certain sublimations easier: artistic talent, intellectual ability, physical prowess. Childhood experiences that encouraged curiosity and creativity, while also establishing firm prohibitions against direct instinctual expression, created conditions favorable for sublimation. Freud also recognized that sublimation had limits and could break down under stress. An artist whose creative work had successfully channeled sexual and aggressive energy might develop neurotic symptoms if the sublimation became inadequate. A scientist whose intellectual pursuits represented sublimated curiosity might experience creative blocks when unconscious conflicts became too intense. The relationship between psychopathology and creativity particularly interested Freud. He observed that many great artists and writers had experienced psychological difficulties, suggesting that neurotic conflict might actually fuel creative production. The same sensitivity and intensity that predisposed toward neurosis might also enhance artistic perception and expression. However, Freud did not romanticize mental illness or claim that pathology was necessary for creativity. Severe neurosis typically interfered with productivity rather than enhancing it. The most successful sublimation occurred when psychological conflict was neither completely absent nor overwhelming, when the ego maintained sufficient control to shape unconscious material into coherent artistic forms. Freud applied his analysis of sublimation to understanding cultural institutions and practices. Religion, he suggested, represented collective sublimation of Oedipal conflicts and primitive taboos. Warfare channeled aggressive drives into socially sanctioned destruction of enemies. Legal systems sublimated aggressive and sexual impulses into abstract principles of justice and social order. Different cultures encouraged different forms of sublimation and varied in their tolerance for instinctual expression. Some societies were relatively permissive sexually, but demanded strict control of aggression. Others allowed certain forms of violence, but imposed strict sexual prohibitions. These cultural variations created different psychological pressures and characteristic forms of pathology. Modern psychology has complicated Freud's sublimation concept while preserving some of its insights. The specific claim that all creativity derives from redirected sexual energy has not been supported. Creative motivation appears more complex and multifaceted than Freud's drive theory suggested. Artistic and scientific achievements cannot be reduced to sublimated instincts. However, the broader recognition that psychological conflict can fuel creativity remains valid. Many artists do draw on personal pain, forbidden desires, and unconscious material in their work. The transformation of private psychological contents into publicly valuable cultural products does occur through processes that resemble what Freud called sublimation. The connection between inner psychological life and outward cultural achievement that Freud emphasized has enriched our understanding of both. Part 10. The Case Studies. Freud's theoretical ideas emerged from and were tested against his clinical work with individual patients. His famous case studies offer windows into the psychoanalytic process and reveal both the power and limitations of his approach. These detailed narratives of therapeutic encounters became foundational texts for psychoanalysis and influenced generations of therapists. The case of Anna O., actually Bertha Pappenheim, treated by Joseph Breuer rather than Freud himself, appeared in Studies on Hysteria and helped establish the talking cure. Anna O. suffered from dramatic symptoms, paralysis, hallucinations, speech difficulties. Breuer discovered that having her talk about each symptom's origin while under hypnosis led to the symptom's disappearance. She called this process chimney sweeping. Freud initially believed that hysteria always originated in childhood sexual trauma, but he later concluded that many memories of seduction were actually fantasies, expressing forbidden wishes rather than actual events. This controversial shift from trauma theory to fantasy theory changed psychoanalysis fundamentally, emphasizing unconscious wishes over external events. The case of Dora, Ida Bauer, illustrated Freud's dream interpretation technique and his understanding of hysteria. Dora, an 18-year-old girl, was brought to Freud by her father because of various nervous symptoms. Freud's analysis revealed a complex web of sexual tensions involving Dora, her father's friend Herr K, and Herr K's wife. Freud interpreted Dora's symptoms as expressing repressed sexual wishes toward Herr K and unconscious jealousy regarding her father's affair with Frau K. Her rejection of Herr K's advances masked deeper attraction to him. Her disgust at his kiss represented a reversal of sexual excitement she could not acknowledge. However, Dora abruptly terminated treatment after 3 months, leaving Freud's therapeutic work incomplete. He later recognized that he had failed to interpret her transference, her feelings toward him that replicated earlier relationship patterns. This failure taught Freud the importance of analyzing transference as central to therapeutic success. The case of Little Hans, Herbert Graf, was Freud's first detailed study of childhood neurosis. Hans, a 5-year-old boy, developed a phobia of horses after witnessing a horse falling in the street. Freud interpreted the phobia as displaced fear of his father, stemming from Oedipal anxiety. Hans unconsciously feared that his father would castrate him as punishment for his desires toward his mother. Through analysis conducted partly by Hans's father under Freud's supervision, the phobia eventually resolved. Freud saw this as confirming his theories about childhood sexuality and the Oedipus complex. However, critics noted that the analysis was conducted through the father, creating obvious problems of suggestion and interpretation. The Ratman case, Ernst Lanzer, illustrated obsessional neurosis. The patient suffered from obsessive thoughts, particularly a horrifying fantasy involving rats and compulsive rituals. Freud traced these symptoms to conflicts over aggression, particularly unconscious rage toward the patient's father and ambivalence about his romantic relationship. The analysis revealed how symptoms represented compromise formations between forbidden aggressive wishes and defenses against those wishes. The patient's elaborate rituals simultaneously expressed and controlled hostile impulses. Understanding the unconscious meaning of symptoms led to their gradual resolution. The Wolfman case, Sergei Pankachev, was Freud's most extensive analysis, continuing for several years. The patient suffered from severe neurosis that Freud traced to a childhood primal scene, allegedly witnessing his parents' sexual intercourse at 18 months of age. This traumatic observation supposedly shaped the patient's later sexual conflicts and neurotic symptoms. Freud reconstructed this scene from the patient's dream of white wolves sitting in a tree, using detailed analysis of symbols and associations. However, the patient later disputed aspects of Freud's interpretation, and scholars have debated whether the primal scene was an actual memory, a fantasy, or a construction created through the analytic process. The case of Judge Schreiber, Daniel Paul Schreiber, demonstrated Freud's analysis of psychosis without actually treating the patient. Freud based his analysis entirely on Schreiber's published memoir describing his psychotic delusions. He interpreted Schreiber's paranoid beliefs, particularly the delusion that God was transforming him into a woman, as defending against unconscious homosexual wishes. This case extended psychoanalytic theory to psychotic disorders and introduced concepts like projection and the role of repressed homosexuality in paranoia. However, it also revealed the limitations of analyzing someone based only on written accounts without therapeutic contact. These case studies have been subject to extensive criticism. Feminist critics noted that Freud often dismissed his female patients' accounts of actual sexual abuse, reinterpreting them as fantasies. The suggestive nature of his interpretations may have shaped patients' productions rather than revealing pre-existing unconscious contents. His theoretical presuppositions influenced what he saw in the clinical material. Moreover, follow-up studies of some patients revealed that Freud's therapeutic success was sometimes overstated. Some patients relapsed or never fully recovered. The Wolfman, for instance, required further analysis with other therapists and never achieved complete cure despite years of treatment. However, the case studies also demonstrated Freud's remarkable clinical sensitivity and his ability to perceive patterns in seemingly disconnected material. His careful attention to details, his tracking of associations, and his willingness to revise interpretations when they proved inadequate all represented important contributions to clinical method. The case studies established the detailed clinical narrative as a form of psychoanalytic evidence alongside theoretical argumentation. They showed how abstract concepts like repression, transference, and unconscious conflict manifested in actual therapeutic encounters. They revealed the messy complexity of real psychological suffering that could not be captured in neat theoretical formulations. Part 11. Freud's influence on modern culture. Freud's impact extended far beyond clinical psychology and psychiatry to transform modern culture in fundamental ways. His concepts entered everyday language, shaped artistic movements, influenced educational practices, and changed how people understood themselves and their relationships. Even those who never read Freud absorbed his ideas through their pervasive cultural presence. The very language people use to discuss psychological experience bears Freud's mark. Terms like unconscious, repression, defense mechanism, Freudian slip, Oedipus complex, anal retentive, and ego have become common parlance. People speak casually about childhood trauma, sexual symbolism in dreams, and subconscious motivations. This vocabulary reflects a fundamentally Freudian way of thinking about the mind. Freud's influence on literature and art was particularly profound. The Surrealist movement explicitly embraced psychoanalytic concepts, particularly the emphasis on dreams and unconscious imagery. Artists like Salvador Dali and André Breton used automatic writing, dream imagery, and free association to access unconscious contents. They saw psychoanalysis as liberating art from rational constraints and conventional forms. Literary modernism incorporated Freudian insights about the complexity of consciousness. Stream of consciousness techniques in writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf reflected psychoanalytic understanding of how thoughts associate and how conscious experience mingles with unconscious material. Literary criticism adopted psychoanalytic approaches, interpreting texts through concepts like symbolism, condensation, and displacement. Film directors recognized cinema's capacity to represent psychological experience in ways that paralleled dreams. Directors like Alfred Hitchcock created suspense by suggesting unconscious motivations and forbidden desires. Film noir explored the dark side of human psychology, the criminal impulses and sexual obsessions that civilized consciousness tried to suppress. Psychoanalytic concepts provided frameworks for understanding character psychology and narrative structure. Freud's impact on education and child rearing was mixed but significant. His emphasis on early childhood's formative importance influenced developmental psychology and pediatrics. Educators paid more attention to children's emotional needs and psychological development. However, some popularizations of Freud led to problematic practices, like excessively permissive parenting, based on misunderstanding his theories about repression. The sexual revolution of the 1960s drew partly on Freudian ideas, particularly the notion that Victorian sexual repression caused neurosis. If psychological health required acknowledging sexuality rather than repressing it, then liberalizing sexual attitudes might reduce suffering. However, Freud himself was more conservative than this interpretation suggested. He believed some renunciation of instinctual freedom was necessary for civilization. Advertising and marketing adopted Freudian concepts, particularly the idea that unconscious desires drive consumer behavior. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, pioneered techniques of persuasion based on appealing to unconscious motivations rather than rational considerations. Advertisements began selling products by associating them with sexual appeal, status, or emotional satisfaction, rather than focusing solely on practical features. Political propaganda also drew on psychoanalytic insights about mass psychology, group identification, and the projection of aggression onto enemies. Understanding the unconscious dynamics of group behavior helped both democratic and totalitarian regimes influence public opinion. This represented a darker application of Freud's ideas to manipulation rather than liberation. The therapeutic culture that characterizes modern Western societies owes much to Freud. The assumption that psychological suffering warrants professional treatment, that talking about problems can help resolve them, that self-understanding promotes well-being. All these ideas reflect Freudian influence. The proliferation of various psychotherapies, even those that reject Freudian theory, occurred in a cultural context Freud helped create. Part 12. Scientific Critiques and Empirical Challenges. While Freud's cultural influence remained strong, his theories faced mounting scientific criticism throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The rise of empirical psychology, with its emphasis on controlled experiments and quantifiable data, created standards that psychoanalysis struggled to meet. Critics questioned whether Freud's theories were truly scientific or merely unfalsifiable speculation. The philosopher Karl Popper famously argued that psychoanalysis was not genuinely scientific because its theories could not be falsified. For any behavior or symptom, psychoanalysis could provide an explanation. But the theory's flexibility made it impossible to specify what observations would disprove it. If a patient improved, this confirmed the interpretation. If they got worse, this showed resistance or negative therapeutic reaction. The theory seemed to explain everything while predicting nothing specific. Experimental psychologists criticized the lack of controlled studies supporting psychoanalytic claims. Freud's evidence came primarily from clinical observations of individual cases, a methodology that introduced numerous biases and confounds. Therapist expectations could shape patient productions. Selective memory could influence what was reported and recorded. The absence of control groups made it impossible to determine whether changes resulted from treatment or other factors. Specific Freudian hypotheses that were testable often failed empirical examination. Studies of dream content did not support the universal symbolism Freud proposed. Research on child development did not confirm the sequence of psychosexual stages or the centrality of the Oedipus complex. Investigations of defense mechanisms showed they operated differently than Freud suggested. The sexual etiology of neurosis proved far less universal than he claimed. The theory of repressed memories, central to Freud's early trauma theory, became particularly controversial. Research showed that memory was far more malleable and reconstructive than Freud assumed. False memories could be created through suggestion. The recovery of repressed traumatic memories in therapy sometimes reflected therapist influence rather than genuine recollection. This led to accusations that some therapists were implanting false memories of childhood abuse. Neuroscience challenged Freud's model of mental structure and function. The idea, ego, and superego did not correspond to identifiable brain systems. The hydraulic model of psychic energy-seeking discharge had no neural basis. Many mental processes occurred unconsciously, but not in the way Freud's dynamic unconscious suggested. Brain mechanisms for memory, emotion, and motivation worked differently than psychoanalytic theory proposed. Developmental psychology provided alternative accounts of child development that better fit empirical evidence. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby, himself trained in psychoanalysis, explained infant caregiver bonds without relying on drive theory or psychosexual stages. Research on cognitive development showed that children's thinking progressed through stages, but not the ones Freud described. Social learning theory demonstrated that behavior could be acquired through observation and conditioning without unconscious conflict. Psychotherapy. Research raised questions about psychoanalysis's therapeutic effectiveness. Controlled studies comparing different treatments often found that psychoanalysis produced no better outcomes than shorter, less expensive therapies. The specific mechanisms Freud proposed, making the unconscious conscious, working through transference, did not seem necessary for therapeutic change. Common factors like therapeutic alliance and patient expectations appeared more important than psychoanalytic techniques. The feminist critique discussed earlier represented another major challenge. If Freud's theories about women reflected patriarchal bias rather than objective observation, this called into question his entire approach. The same biases that shaped his views on femininity might have distorted his understanding of other aspects of psychology. Cultural and historical context influenced what he saw in his patients and how he interpreted their symptoms. Cross-cultural research complicated claims about universal psychological processes. The Oedipus complex did not appear equally in all cultures, suggesting it might reflect Western family structure rather than human nature. Cultures varied enormously in child-rearing practices, sexual norms, and social organization, producing different personality patterns than Freud's theory predicted. The assumption that his Viennese patients represented universal human psychology proved problematic. Defenders of psychoanalysis responded to these criticisms in various ways. Some argued that psychoanalysis was a hermeneutic discipline, concerned with interpretation and meaning, rather than causal explanation. Its criteria for success should be narrative coherence and therapeutic effectiveness, rather than experimental proof. Others pointed to research supporting modified psychoanalytic concepts, even if Freud's specific formulations were incorrect. Contemporary psychoanalysts acknowledged that many of Freud's specific theories required revision or abandonment. Few still accepted his drive theory, his psychosexual stages, or his theory of female development in their original forms. However, they maintained that core insights remained valuable. Unconscious processes influence behavior, childhood experiences shape personality, therapeutic relationships facilitate change, and psychological defenses protect against anxiety. Some researchers attempted to test psychoanalytic hypotheses using modern methodologies. Studies of subliminal perception provided some support for unconscious influence on behavior, though not in exactly the way Freud proposed. Research on defense mechanisms showed that people did use various strategies to manage threatening information. Neuropsychoanalysis emerged as a field attempting to integrate psychoanalytic concepts with neuroscientific findings. However, many psychologists concluded that while Freud raised important questions about human psychology, his specific answers were largely wrong. The mind did process information unconsciously, but through cognitive mechanisms rather than Freudian repression. Childhood did influence adult personality, but through attachment patterns and social learning rather than psychosexual fixations. Therapy could help people change, but through cognitive restructuring or behavioral modification rather than psychoanalytic insight. The scientific critique of Freud raised deeper questions about the nature of psychological knowledge. Could the complexity of human experience be adequately captured through controlled experiments? Did emphasis on quantifiable variables miss important aspects of subjective life? Was narrative understanding of individual cases valuable even if not scientifically rigorous? These methodological debates continued long after Freud's death. Part 13. The fragmentation of the psychoanalytic movement. Even during Freud's lifetime, the psychoanalytic movement experienced significant conflicts and fragmentations. Freud's most talented early followers often developed theoretical disagreements that led to bitter splits and competing schools of psychoanalysis. These disputes revealed both the creative ferment Freud's ideas generated and his difficulty tolerating dissent from his own views. The first major defection came from Alfred Adler, an early member of Freud's Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Adler disagreed with Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the primary drive and the Oedipus complex as central to psychological development. Instead, Adler emphasized social factors, the drive for power and competence, and what he called the inferiority complex, the sense of inadequacy that motivated people to compensate through achievement. Adler's individual psychology focused on people's striving for superiority and their unique lifestyle patterns. He emphasized conscious goals and social contexts more than unconscious sexuality. His theories were more optimistic than Freud's, suggesting that people could overcome their difficulties through developing social interest and finding constructive ways to compensate for feelings of inferiority. Freud viewed Adler's defection as betrayal and worked to exclude him from psychoanalytic circles. The personal animosity between them illustrated how theoretical disagreements became intertwined with questions of loyalty and authority within the psychoanalytic movement. Carl Jung's break with Freud was even more consequential. Jung had been Freud's chosen heir, the brilliant Swiss psychiatrist who would lead psychoanalysis into the future. But Jung developed increasingly divergent views about the unconscious, sexuality, and psychological development. Jung proposed that beyond the personal unconscious, Freud described existed a collective unconscious shared by all humanity. This collective unconscious contained archetypes, universal symbolic patterns inherited from ancestral experience. Jung saw religious symbolism and mythology as expressions of archetypal themes rather than sublimated sexuality. He viewed psychological development as individuation, the lifelong process of integrating conscious and unconscious elements of personality. The Freud-Jung correspondence reveals the painful deterioration of their relationship. What began as intellectual collaboration and mutual admiration ended in bitter recrimination. Freud could not accept Jung's mystical tendencies and his departure from sexual theory. Jung felt constrained by Freud's dogmatism and his reduction of spiritual concerns to sexual origins. The split with Jung created lasting divisions in depth psychology. Jungian analysis became an alternative tradition, emphasizing symbols, dreams, and spiritual development in ways that differed markedly from classical psychoanalysis. Jung's influence on art, literature, and religious studies rivaled or exceeded Freud's, particularly in understanding mythology and spiritual experience. Otto Rank, another early follower, eventually broke with Freud over his theory of the birth trauma. Rank argued that the separation from the mother at birth created the primary anxiety from which all later anxieties derived. This challenged Freud's emphasis on the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety. Rank also advocated shorter, more active therapy focused on present relationships rather than extensive exploration of childhood. Sándor Ferenczi, perhaps Freud's most creative clinical innovator, developed techniques that emphasized the real relationship between analyst and patient rather than interpretation alone. He believed that patients needed actual emotional experiences in therapy, not just intellectual insight. His experiments with more active, emotionally engaged therapeutic approaches influenced later relational psychoanalysis, but troubled Freud, who valued technical neutrality. The most significant theoretical development within psychoanalysis came from Melanie Klein and the object relations school. Klein worked primarily with children and developed theories emphasizing the infant's relationship with the mother from the earliest months of life. She proposed that infants experienced primitive anxieties about destroying or being destroyed by the mother, and developed defense mechanisms like splitting, seeing mother as all good or all bad, and projective identification. Klein's theories shifted psychoanalytic focus from the Oedipal period to the pre-Oedipal mother-infant relationship. She emphasized aggression and primitive anxiety more than sexuality. Her approach inspired the object relations tradition, which understood psychological development primarily in terms of internalized relationship patterns rather than drive vicissitudes. Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter, became a major figure in child psychoanalysis while remaining more faithful to her father's theories. She focused on ego psychology and defense mechanisms, studying how children developed various psychological defenses to manage anxiety. Her work was less radical than Klein's, but provided systematic exploration of defensive processes. In America, ego psychology became the dominant form of psychoanalysis in mid-20th century. Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kriss, and others emphasized the autonomous functions of the ego that did not arise from conflict. They saw the ego as possessing its own energy and capacities for adaptation to reality. This represented a shift from Freud's focus on ID and unconscious conflict toward understanding conscious adaptive functions. Later developments included self-psychology, pioneered by Heinz Kohut, which emphasized the self's need for empathic mirroring and idealized others. Kohut argued that narcissistic disturbances resulted from failures in early empathic attunement rather than from sexual conflicts. His approach was more affirming and less focused on interpretation of unconscious conflict. Relational psychoanalysis, emerging in recent decades, emphasizes the mutually influencing relationship between analyst and patient. It views therapy as a genuine encounter between two people rather than a situation where an objective analyst interprets a patient's unconscious. This approach draws on attachment theory, infant research, and philosophical critiques of psychoanalytic authority. Lacanian psychoanalysis, based on Jacques Lacan's reinterpretation of Freud, became influential in France and literary studies. Lacan emphasized language and symbolic systems, arguing that the unconscious is structured like a language. His complex theoretical system combined Freudian concepts with structural linguistics and philosophy, creating a psychoanalysis focused on desire, lack, and the symbolic order. These various schools disagreed on fundamental questions. Was sexuality or aggression the primary drive? Did development center on the Oedipal period or earlier mother-infant relationship? Should therapy focus on interpretation or relationship? Was the unconscious essentially linguistic or embodied? Each tradition claimed to represent the true development of Freud's insights, while others had betrayed them. The fragmentation of psychoanalysis reflected both the richness of Freud's legacy and the limitations of his original formulations. His theories raised profound questions that could be answered in multiple ways. Different clinical populations and cultural contexts revealed different aspects of psychological life. No single theoretical framework could encompass the full complexity of human experience. However, the proliferation of competing schools also weakened psychoanalysis as a coherent discipline. Without agreed-upon methods for adjudicating theoretical disputes, psychoanalysis could not develop the cumulative knowledge characteristic of mature sciences. The various schools often talked past each other, lacking common language or criteria for evaluation. Part 14. Legacy and Contemporary Relevance. Sigmund Freud died in London in 1939, having fled Vienna after the Nazi annexation of Austria. He succumbed to the oral cancer that had plagued his final years, the result of his lifelong cigar smoking. He left behind a vast body of work, a fractious psychoanalytic movement, and ideas that had fundamentally transformed modern culture. Assessing Freud's legacy more than 8 decades after his death requires distinguishing what has endured from what has been superseded. Many of his specific theories, the psychosexual stages, penis envy, the death drive, are no longer accepted by most psychologists and psychiatrists. His therapeutic method has been largely replaced by shorter, more focused treatments with better empirical support. His theories about women, homosexuality, and other topics reflect outdated cultural prejudices. Yet Freud's core insights remain influential across multiple domains. The recognition that much mental life occurs outside conscious awareness has been thoroughly vindicated by cognitive neuroscience, even if the mechanisms differ from those Freud proposed. The understanding that childhood experiences shape adult personality continues to inform developmental psychology. The appreciation that therapeutic relationships can facilitate psychological change remains central to psychotherapy. Freud's most enduring contribution may be his transformation of how people think about themselves. Before Freud, people generally assumed they knew their own minds, that consciousness was transparent to itself. Freud permanently disturbed this complacency, showing that human beings are mysteries to themselves, driven by forces they do not understand and cannot directly observe. This loss of psychological innocence paralleled other losses of innocence in modernity. Just as Copernicus displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos, and Darwin displaced humans from their special creation, Freud displaced consciousness from its position of mastery. These successive narcissistic wounds, as Freud called them, forced humanity to accept its peripheral place in the universe, its animal origins, and its psychological opacity to itself. In contemporary psychology, while classical psychoanalysis has declined, psychodynamic approaches continue to evolve. Modern psychodynamic therapy retains Freudian insights about unconscious processes, defense mechanisms, and the therapeutic relationship while abandoning problematic aspects of drive theory and metapsychology. Research has shown that psychodynamic approaches can be effective for certain conditions, particularly depression and personality disorders. Attachment theory, which originated partly within psychoanalysis but developed its own research tradition, has become one of psychology's most robust frameworks for understanding relationship patterns. Based on empirical observation of infant-caregiver interactions, attachment theory preserves Freud's emphasis on early relationships shaping later ones while providing more precise mechanisms and better empirical support. Neuroscience has both challenged and enriched psychoanalytic concepts. While many Freudian hypotheses about brain function were wrong, modern neuroscience has discovered unconscious processing systems, emotional memory systems, and developmental sensitive periods that resonate with psychoanalytic insights. Neuropsychoanalysis attempts to integrate these findings with clinical psychoanalytic understanding. In fields outside psychology, Freud's influence remains strong. Literary criticism continues to employ psychoanalytic concepts to interpret texts, authors, and readers. Film studies uses psychoanalytic theory to analyze cinematic representation, spectator positioning, and the unconscious dimensions of visual experience. Cultural studies applies Freudian ideas to understanding ideology, desire, and subject formation in contemporary culture. Philosophy has engaged extensively with Freud's ideas, particularly continental philosophy. Thinkers like Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Jacques Derrida grappled with psychoanalytic concepts while critiquing Freud's assumptions. His theories about the construction of subjectivity, the role of repression in society, and the relationship between individual and culture raised questions that philosophy continues to address. Feminist theory has had a complex relationship with Freud. While criticizing his patriarchal assumptions, feminist theorists like Juliet Mitchell and Jacqueline Rose found resources in psychoanalysis for understanding how gender is constructed through psychological development in patriarchal culture. Contemporary queer theory similarly uses and critiques Freud, drawing on his insights about the constructed nature of sexuality while rejecting his heteronormative assumptions. The contemporary therapeutic landscape includes diverse approaches that implicitly build on Freudian foundations, even while rejecting his specific theories. The assumption that talking about problems can help, that therapeutic relationships matter, that self-understanding promotes change, all reflect the culture that Freud helped create. Even cognitive behavioral therapy, often presented as an alternative to psychodynamic approaches, operates in a therapeutic culture that Freud pioneered. Freud's ideas remain relevant to understanding contemporary social phenomena. His analysis of group psychology illuminates political movements and mass behavior. His concepts of projection and displacement help explain scapegoating and prejudice. His understanding of how civilization manages instinctual drives speaks to ongoing tensions between individual freedom and social order. The digital age presents new contexts for Freudian concepts. Social media's exhibitionism and voyeurism, online anonymity's release of normally inhibited impulses, virtual reality's relationship to fantasy and desire, all invite psychoanalytic interpretation. The question of how unconscious processes operate in algorithmic environments represents a new frontier for psychoanalytic thinking. However, applying Freud to contemporary issues requires caution. His theories were developed in a specific cultural and historical context, late 19th and early 20th century Vienna, that differs markedly from contemporary globalized multicultural societies. What appeared universal to Freud often reflected particularities of his time and place. His insights must be carefully separated from his culturally bound assumptions. The question of psychoanalysis's future remains open. Classical Freudian psychoanalysis may continue to decline as a therapeutic modality, but psychoanalytic thinking will likely persist in modified forms. The core recognition that human psychology involves unconscious processes, that early experiences matter, that relationships shape development. These insights have become part of common sense that will outlast particular theoretical formulations. Freud's greatest achievement may have been asking the right questions rather than providing the right answers. How do childhood experiences shape adult personality? What role does sexuality play in psychological development? How do people defend against threatening thoughts and feelings? What are the psychological origins of culture and society? These questions remain central to psychology, even when Freud's specific answers are rejected. His method of close attention to individual experience, careful tracking of associations, and sensitivity to symbolic meanings establish standards for clinical work that transcend theoretical differences. His emphasis on taking psychological suffering seriously and listening carefully to how people describe their experience influenced all subsequent psychotherapy, regardless of theoretical orientation. The controversies surrounding Freud are unlikely to be resolved definitively. He will probably remain a polarizing figure, celebrated as a revolutionary genius by some, dismissed as a pseudoscientific charlatan by others. This very controversy reflects the profound challenge his ideas pose to human self-understanding. Comfortable certainties about human rationality and self-knowledge could not survive encounter with Freudian psychoanalysis. Ultimately, Freud's legacy lies not in any specific theory, but in his demonstration that human psychology is far more complex, conflicted, and mysterious than it appears. We are not transparent to ourselves. Our motivations are often hidden. Our desires are frequently unconscious. Our development is shaped by forces we do not choose or fully understand. These unsettling recognitions, however uncomfortable, represent necessary confrontations with psychological reality. Conclusion: the enduring challenge of self-knowledge. As we emerge from this extended exploration of Sigmund Freud's life and ideas, we are left with a paradoxical legacy. Here was a thinker who claimed to have discovered the scientific keys to human psychology, yet whose specific theories have been largely discredited. A physician who created a therapeutic method that has been superseded by more effective treatments. a self-proclaimed scientist whose work inspired more artistic and cultural transformation than empirical research. A man who claimed objectivity while imposing his own biases and assumptions onto his patients and theories. Yet for all these limitations and failures, Freud fundamentally altered how human beings understand themselves. Before Freud, people generally assumed that consciousness was transparent, that they knew why they did what they did, that rational thought governed human behavior. After Freud, such innocence became impossible. We now accept that much of mental life occurs beneath awareness, that our conscious reasons often disguise deeper motivations, that childhood experiences shape adult psychology in ways we cannot fully recognize. This transformation of human self-understanding represents Freud's most profound and lasting contribution. Like Darwin's theory of evolution, which showed that human beings were continuous with animal nature rather than separately created, Freud's psychology revealed that rational consciousness was merely the surface of mental life rather than its entirety. The implications disturbed comfortable assumptions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the possibility of self-knowledge. Freud showed us that we are strangers to ourselves in fundamental ways. We harbor wishes we do not acknowledge, memories we cannot access, conflicts we cannot resolve. We defend against threatening truths through elaborate psychological maneuvers that operate outside awareness. We repeat patterns established in childhood without recognizing their origins. We project our own unacceptable impulses onto others. We construct narratives about ourselves that serve psychological needs, rather than representing accurate self-knowledge. These recognitions are uncomfortable, even disturbing. It is more pleasant to believe that we understand ourselves completely, that our conscious thoughts and intentions explain our behavior, that we are rational actors making informed choices. Freud denied us these comforting illusions, insisting that honesty about human nature required confronting its irrational, conflicted, and unconscious dimensions. Yet this confrontation with psychological reality was not meant to induce despair, but to enable greater freedom. Freud believed that unconscious conflicts cause suffering precisely because they operated outside awareness. Making the unconscious conscious, the fundamental goal of psychoanalysis, allowed people to understand their own motivations and make more informed choices. Self-knowledge, however painful, offered the possibility of liberation from neurotic repetition. The psychoanalytic dictum, "Where it was, their ego shall be," expressed this liberatory aspiration. The goal was not to eliminate unconscious drives, this was impossible, but to expand conscious awareness and control. The ego could never completely master the ID, but it could achieve better balance between competing psychological forces. People could not eliminate their conflicts, but they could understand and manage them more effectively. This modest therapeutic goal reflected Freud's tragic vision of human nature. Unlike optimistic therapies promising complete self-actualization or perfect mental health, psychoanalysis aimed only to transform neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness. The human condition necessarily involved conflict between biological drives and social demands, between individual desires and cultural prohibitions, between conscious intentions and unconscious motivations. Complete resolution of these tensions was impossible. Yet acknowledging this tragic dimension did not mean accepting passive resignation. Freud advocated active engagement with psychological reality, honest examination of one's own mind, and courageous confrontation with uncomfortable truths. The examined life, even if it revealed disturbing contents, was superior to the unexamined life built on illusions and repressions. His vision of civilization shared this tragic quality. Civilization was humanity's greatest achievement, enabling cooperation, creativity, and cultural progress. Yet civilization necessarily required renunciation of instinctual freedom, creating permanent tension between individual desire and social necessity. No perfect resolution existed. Greater instinctual freedom meant less civilization, while more civilization meant greater psychological suffering. The best that could be achieved was intelligent management of this inevitable tension. Understanding the psychological costs of civilization might allow societies to find better balances between individual freedom and social order. Recognizing that moral prohibitions became internalized as harsh superegos might encourage more humane child-rearing and education. Accepting that aggression could not be eliminated might lead to wiser management of its expression. Freud's influence on how we think about these fundamental questions persists even among those who reject his specific theories. The recognition that individual psychology and social organization are intimately connected, that culture shapes consciousness, while consciousness shapes culture, that understanding human behavior requires examining both biological drives and social contexts. These insights have become commonplace in ways that make their revolutionary origin easy to forget. Similarly, Freud's impact on therapeutic practice endures in transformed form. The idea that talking about psychological difficulties can provide relief, that therapeutic relationships facilitate change, that understanding one's own patterns enables modification of them. These assumptions underpin diverse therapeutic approaches that may not acknowledge their debt to psychoanalysis. The therapeutic culture of contemporary Western societies exists in a conceptual space that Freud helped create. The controversies surrounding Freud will continue because his ideas challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and raise questions without definitive answers. Are human beings primarily rational or irrational? How much can people understand themselves? To what extent do biological drives determine behavior? Can consciousness control unconscious processes? What is the relationship between individual psychology and social organization? Freud proposed answers to these questions that many found unacceptable. Human beings are fundamentally irrational, driven by unconscious forces they do not understand. Self-knowledge is partial at best, always incomplete, never fully transparent. Biological drives powerfully shape behavior even in highly civilized people. Consciousness can moderate, but never eliminate unconscious influences. Individual psychology and social organization are locked in perpetual tension without possibility of perfect resolution. These conclusions disturbed comfortable illusions about human nature. They suggested that the Enlightenment faith in reason and progress was naive, that human beings were darker and more conflicted than they appeared to themselves, that civilization's achievements came at psychological costs that could not be eliminated. No wonder many people preferred to reject Freud's vision entirely, rather than accept its disturbing implications. Yet perhaps the greatest measure of Freud's importance is precisely this capacity to disturb, to challenge, to force confrontation with uncomfortable possibilities. Great thinkers do not merely confirm what we already believe, but push us to think differently about ourselves and our world. They ask questions we would rather avoid and propose answers we resist accepting. They permanently alter the conceptual landscape, even when their specific theories are rejected. Freud belongs in the company of those rare thinkers who fundamentally transformed human self-understanding. Like Copernicus showing that Earth was not the center of the universe, like Darwin demonstrating that humans evolved from other animals, Freud revealed that consciousness was not the center of mental life. These successive displacements of humanity from positions of centrality and mastery were painful but necessary recognitions of reality. The irony is that Freud pursued these disturbing insights in the name of science and reason. He believed that honest examination of psychological reality would ultimately prove liberating, that knowledge, however uncomfortable, was preferable to ignorance. He maintained faith that understanding unconscious processes would expand human freedom and reduce suffering, even as his theories emphasized the limits of rational control. This tension between scientific ambition and tragic vision, between therapeutic optimism and cultural pessimism, between faith in self-knowledge and recognition of its limits, these contradictions run throughout Freud's work. They reflect genuine complexities in the human condition that cannot be resolved through simple formulas or one-sided perspectives. As we navigate the complexities of contemporary life, the information overload of digital culture, the dissolution of traditional social structures, the multiplicity of identity possibilities, the acceleration of technological change, Freud's insights remain relevant in unexpected ways. His emphasis on how early relationships shape later ones illuminates attachment patterns in an age of fragmented families. His understanding of how unconscious processes operate speaks to how we navigate algorithmically mediated environments. His analysis of civilization's discontents addresses ongoing tensions between individual authenticity and social conformity. The challenge is to learn from Freud without becoming trapped in his specific theoretical framework or limited by his cultural prejudices. This requires discriminating between genuine insights and historical artifacts, between concepts that illuminate human experience and assumptions that reflect outdated beliefs. It means appreciating what Freud discovered while acknowledging what he got wrong. For contemporary readers encountering Freud, several principles might guide engagement with his legacy. First, recognize that his importance lies more in the questions he raised than the answers he provided. The questions about unconscious motivation, childhood development, psychological conflict, and the relationship between individual and society remain vital even when his specific theories are rejected. Second, understand that psychoanalysis emerged from specific historical circumstances that shaped its concepts and assumptions. Freud's theories reflected late 19th century Vienna, its sexual repression, its patriarchal family structure, its class divisions, its cultural preoccupations. Translating his insights to other contexts requires critical interpretation rather than mechanical application. Third, appreciate that psychological understanding requires multiple perspectives and methodologies. The detailed clinical narrative that Freud pioneered offers insights that experimental research cannot provide, while controlled studies reveal patterns that individual case studies might miss. Neither approach alone captures the full complexity of human psychology. Fourth, recognize that Freud's flaws and limitations do not negate his contributions. That he was wrong about women, that he overemphasized sexuality, that he imposed theoretical presuppositions onto clinical material. These failures do not erase his genuine discoveries about unconscious processes, defense mechanisms, and the complexity of human motivation. Finally, remember that the goal of psychological understanding is ultimately practical: to reduce suffering, expand freedom, and help people live more satisfying lives. Theoretical elegance matters less than therapeutic effectiveness. The test of psychological ideas is whether they help people understand themselves and change in ways that promote well-being. Freud would likely be troubled by how much of his specific theoretical edifice has been dismantled or abandoned. He viewed psychoanalysis as a scientific system that would endure in its essential form, even as details were refined. The fragmentation into competing schools, the rejection of core concepts like drive theory, the declining influence of classical analysis, all this would disappoint someone who hoped to found a unified scientific psychology. Yet, he might also appreciate that his fundamental project continues in modified form. The attempt to understand the hidden dimensions of mental life, to trace the complex pathways between childhood experience and adult psychology, to examine how human beings defend against threatening truths, to explore the relationship between individual consciousness and social organization. These investigations persist across diverse theoretical approaches that claim his legacy while revising his conclusions. In the end, Freud's greatest gift may have been his demonstration that human beings are worthy of sustained, serious, sympathetic investigation. Before psychoanalysis, nervous disorders were often dismissed as malingering or moral weakness. Psychological suffering was not taken as seriously as physical disease. The inner lives of ordinary people seemed unworthy of the attention given to philosophical or religious questions. Freud insisted that every person's psychology was complex and meaningful, that symptoms had sense even when they seemed nonsensical, that understanding required careful attention to the unique details of individual experience. This democratic sensibility, the belief that every person's inner life deserved respectful examination, represented a profound shift in how human beings were valued and understood. The talking cure emerged from this fundamental respect for psychological experience. By listening carefully to what patients said, by taking their symptoms seriously, by attending to the associative connections they made, Freud demonstrated that genuine understanding required sustained engagement with individual subjectivity. This methodological principle transcended his specific theories and influenced all subsequent forms of psychotherapy. As we look back across more than a century since Freud's major works appeared, we can see both how much has changed and how much endures. The specific content of psychoanalytic theory has been largely superseded. The therapeutic techniques have been refined and often replaced. The cultural context that gave rise to Freud's particular concerns has vanished. Yet the fundamental challenge he identified remains. How can human beings achieve genuine self-knowledge when so much of mental life occurs outside awareness? How can consciousness understand and regulate processes that are by definition unconscious? How can we become more free when we are shaped by forces we did not choose and cannot fully recognize? These questions have no final answers, but the ongoing attempt to address them constitutes a significant dimension of modern intellectual and cultural life. Freud did not solve these problems. Perhaps they cannot be solved. But he forced us to confront them with new seriousness and sophistication. His legacy is thus not primarily a set of theories to be accepted or rejected, but an ongoing challenge to examine our own minds honestly, to question comfortable assumptions about human nature, to maintain curiosity about the hidden dimensions of psychological life, and to face the complexity and contradictions of human experience without flinching. In an age that often prefers simple explanations and quick solutions, that reduces human beings to their visible behaviors or their conscious self-reports, that treats psychology as merely another commodity to be marketed and consumed, Freud reminds us that genuine understanding requires patience, nuance, and willingness to sit with uncertainty and paradox. We are more mysterious to ourselves than we usually acknowledge. Our motivations are more complex than we admit. Our psychological lives are richer, darker, and stranger than surface appearances suggest. These uncomfortable recognitions, which Freud spent his career elaborating and defending, represent necessary correctives to superficial optimism and premature certainty. Whether we accept or reject his specific theories, whether we embrace or critique his methods, whether we admire or condemn his character, we cannot escape the fundamental transformation of human self-understanding that Freud initiated. We live in a post-Freudian world where unconscious processes, childhood influences, psychological defenses, and therapeutic relationships are taken for granted in ways that would have been unimaginable before psychoanalysis. This represents Freud's true achievement and enduring significance. He permanently altered how human beings think about themselves, creating conceptual space for understanding aspects of experience that had previously been ignored or misunderstood. He showed that beneath the civilized surface of consciousness churned forces more primitive, powerful, and influential than rational thought could fully master. The journey into the unconscious that Freud pioneered remains incomplete and perhaps incompletable. Each generation must undertake its own exploration of the hidden depths, using tools and concepts appropriate to its time while learning from past investigations. Freud provided the initial maps for this territory, even though subsequent explorers have found those maps incomplete or inaccurate in important respects. As we continue this ongoing exploration of human psychology, we carry forward Freud's essential insight that self-knowledge, however difficult and incomplete, represents a worthy pursuit, that understanding our own minds, however imperfectly, enables greater freedom and reduces suffering, and that the Ho-ish, examined life despite its challenges and discomforts, remains superior to passive acceptance of comfortable illusions. In this sense, Freud's project continues. The specific theories may change, the therapeutic methods may evolve, the cultural contexts may shift, but the fundamental challenge of understanding ourselves, of confronting the stranger within, of navigating the tension between consciousness and unconsciousness, between reason and desire, between individual authenticity and social belonging, this challenge remains as urgent and unresolved as when Freud first mapped its contours over a century ago. And so we remain, like Freud himself, explorers of inner space, navigators of unconscious depths, seekers after elusive self-knowledge. We may use different maps and different methods than he employed, but we travel the same territory he first systematically explored. His journey into the unconscious opened paths that we continue to follow, modify, and extend as we pursue the ancient injunction inscribed at Delphi. Know thyself. That this knowledge remains forever incomplete, that the unconscious by definition exceeds consciousness's grasp, that new questions emerge faster than old ones can be answered. None of this negates the value of the pursuit. Freud taught us that the attempt to understand ourselves, even when it reveals disturbing truths, represents perhaps the most fundamentally human of all activities. In this teaching lies his most profound and lasting legacy. Path was constrained by the anti-Semitism that pervaded late 19th century Vienna. Despite his brilliance, certain professions remained largely closed to Jews. He chose medicine not out of passionate interest in healing, but because it offered one of the few routes to intellectual respectability and financial security available to someone of his background. He would later write that he felt no particular calling to relieve suffering or practice medicine in the conventional sense. His interests lay elsewhere, in understanding the fundamental nature of human consciousness and behavior. After completing his medical degree, Freud spent several years in neurological research, studying the anatomy of the nervous system and investigating the properties of cocaine as a potential therapeutic agent. This latter research would prove personally troubling when a close friend became addicted to the drug Freud had recommended. The incident taught him early about the dangerous complexity of the human mind and the unforeseen consequences of medical intervention. A pivotal moment came when Freud traveled to Paris to study with Jean-Martin Charcot, the renowned neurologist who was using hypnosis to treat hysteria. Charcot demonstrated that physical symptoms could arise from psychological causes, that paralysis and seizures could occur without any detectable organic damage to the nervous system. This revelation suggested that the mind possessed hidden depths that could powerfully influence the body, depths that conscious awareness could not directly access. Returning to Vienna, Freud began his private practice treating patients with nervous disorders. Working initially with Joseph Breuer, he developed what they called the talking cure, a method that involved having patients speak freely about their symptoms, memories, and associations. Freud noticed that when patients were able to recall and express certain traumatic memories, their symptoms often improved. This suggested that psychological suffering arose not just from present circumstances, but from forgotten or repressed experiences that continued to exert influence from some hidden realm of the mind. What makes Freud unique among medical practitioners and scientists is his willingness to follow his observations into territories that respectable Victorian society considered forbidden or nonsensical. He began to notice patterns in his patients' associations and dreams that pointed towards sexual conflicts and forbidden desires. He observed that many nervous symptoms seemed connected to childhood experiences and family relationships. Most radically, he started to theorize that much of mental life occurred outside conscious awareness, that human beings were driven by forces they neither understood nor controlled. Through his clinical work, his self-analysis, and his theoretical writings, Freud constructed an entirely new map of the human mind. He showed us that consciousness was merely the visible surface of a vast psychological ocean, that beneath our rational thoughts and civilized behaviors churned primitive drives, infantile wishes, and unacceptable impulses. He argued that human beings were fundamentally conflicted creatures, torn between animal instincts and social demands, between pleasure-seeking impulses and moral prohibitions. His ideas remain as controversial today as they were over a century ago. Some view Freud as a brilliant pioneer who revealed fundamental truths about human nature. Others see him as a misguided theorist who imposed his own obsessions onto vulnerable patients and built an elaborate pseudoscientific system without adequate evidence. But regardless of whether one accepts or rejects his specific theories, Freud's influence on modern culture is undeniable. He changed how we talk about ourselves, how we understand family relationships, how we interpret art and literature, and how we think about the sources of human suffering and the possibilities for healing.